Hi, everybody. This is Dr. David P. Perrodin, and welcome to the Week 4 Fireside Chat for Educational Leadership 655, Pupil Services and Non-Discrimination with Viterbo University in La Crosse, Wisconsin. This week begins Monday, February 9th, and concludes on Sunday, February 15th, 2026. A recap. Your SWOT assignment was due on February 7th. I will download them, print them, and grade them, scan them, and return them to you within the week. At that time, I will also update the gradebook. If I feel that you are falling behind in class, I will contact you. Good job with your CESA services or community services that are currently contracted by your district. And some of you also explained, again, those community alliances, such as district collaboration with county human services or often third-party mental health providers. Per my observation, schools are moving rapidly toward outsourcing professional development to CESA, especially in schools with under 1,000 total student enrollment. What might that mean for PBIS or nonviolent crisis training, right? How will the CESA content align with district content? And talk with your business manager about 6630 agreements. These are shared service agreements between two districts under Wisconsin law. It's a way for two or even sometimes more districts to share the salary, benefits, and other cost of an employee. And this is particularly helpful with someone who obviously is seeking to be employed full-time, but might work in a low instance area, such as educational audiologists, or it could be a school counselor being split across a couple districts. So here's an example. We have District A and District B. They both need a school counselor, but they don't need a full-time counselor at either site. So under a 6630 agreement, the counselor would be hired full-time by, let's say, District A, and they would be there 3 days a week, and they would be supporting over at District B 2 days a week. District A is then the fiscal agent, so they are paying that salary and paying the benefits, and District B then is paying 2/5 of salary and benefits over to District A. So the benefit is the person is hired full-time, because it's going to be very difficult to find a low incidence provider, or example, just to find a school counselor for 3 days a week. Most people want full-time enrollment. So again, look into 6630 agreements, and I've seen those quite a bit actually with speech language services, but can also be broadened out to counseling, mental health, school psychologists, and so on. Happening now and impacting schools, immigration enforcement activities. Per Defending Education, there's a nationwide database of K-12 sanctuary schools and closed borders resolutions and policies. As of January 27th, and you're seeing it on the screen now, Madison and Milwaukee were listed on it. As a Pupil Services Director, be aware of your Board of Education policy regarding ICE agents on campus, and also make sure you have a clear understanding and inter-rater reliability across your buildings, including your community-based 4K sites. Is there a principal or teacher in your district who would feel that putting immigrant students in their car and driving them away from school will be an action justified per Board of Education policy if ICE agents were arriving on campus? They might argue, I was acting in the best interest of the student. I read the school policy, I read the school statement, the Board of Education statement about sanctuary district, and I believe my actions aligned with that. I feel that has become a large a matter for schools right now, and I would recommend holding an all-staff meeting and just interpreting what your district position is for interfacing with ICE potentially ICE on campus, and then also to have staff raise their hand if they have questions, and just so you can calibrate where everybody is, because I think there is a lot of variance in how people can interpret the actions that they are, I guess, permitted or authorized to take if ICE agents are on campus. So those are discussions you want to get way out ahead of. So Title IX pivot, including the NCAA. So we saw that last year in the WIAA also changed to match the Title IX pivot of the regarding athletes, male and female athletes. So just reviewing your policy with that and making sure that your Board of Education policy aligns with what is actually being carried out in your district. This is lesser, but it is also important because if I don't bring it up here, it won't get brought up anywhere else. And this is a pupil services matter. School door building codes, lesser coverage, but important, right? You probably haven't heard about this before, but revisions to the national building codes for interior school doors mean that in 2027, doors in schools, daycare centers, colleges, and universities will be required to be lockable rather than being permitted to be lockable. The requirements apply to classrooms, offices, and other occupied rooms in the applicable use groups. In addition to the mandates to this section, there will be their specific language. The doors shall be capable of being locked from the inside. Okay, so, but let's think about this. What does that mean? Think about your 4K partner sites, how they're going to approach this. Multiple code and design updates to entrance vestibules will be happening. And another, talk to your buildings and grounds director and learn, what are we doing for our entrances to our schools and locks, and who has key fobs, right? And just so you have that down. And here's, I think, probably the most important part if you're a pupil service director. Be an advocate for students with disabilities and English language learners. You do not want a situation where you have a door, let's say in a kindergarten classroom or a classroom for English language learners, and in order to get out of that classroom, you have to enter a code that's on the wall. You have to punch it in, and then you have to hold the handle down and hold a button in and count to 3, something like that, right? And that stuff is actually being implemented in schools. So it's not just kind of a crazy statement that I'm making. So we're seeing this kind of bypass of fire code and just some common sense design on some of these locking mechanisms. And the pupil services director needs to look at that from the standpoint of, what if it is a student who is an English language learner who is unable to read these directions, or what if it is a student who's using a wheelchair, and now instead of what is traditional of turning a handle or pulling a handle down, has these additional steps involved in it. And there's something called face validity. I wrote about it in the Velocity of Information. Basically, face validity, think about if you have a thermometer and you're outside and it's snowing and you look at the thermometer and it says 85 degrees. Well, something is wrong, right? Face validity, that just doesn't make sense. Either the thermometer is broken or you're delusional, but something's not right. So if you are in a classroom and it feels like an escape room, you've got to do all of these procedures to get the door unlocked and all of that, then something is wrong. Week 4, shout outs. Mason wrote that we also have a contract with our CESA for, ironically enough, audiology services. And these contracts are in place due to limited hours of service provided or general struggles to fill the positions. So really fascinating. Mason, low incidence providers such as educational audiologists are very scarce. When I was with CESA, we would advertise across the country for these positions, and we would work with our neighboring CESAs, right? And they would be posting, but literally posting at that time, right? It was a newspaper in California or newspaper in North Carolina, come to Wisconsin, and we also needed to provide that at the time to the DPI to show that we were attempting to fill these services, because students would have IEPs for services and we weren't able to meet the services because we didn't have a provider. So we needed to document the efforts to try to do that. Another area, and I covered this extensively in my 2019 PBS TV presentation, how few child psychiatrists are in Wisconsin, especially when you get north of Highway 8. Very few. So parents waiting months to get even their first appointment. So again, we look at advocacy as the pupil service director and testifying before the legislature. That is a point to testify on. Like, what can we do? How can we incentivize to increase the number of child psychiatrists in the state? A unique and possibly challenging variable in what Mason was saying with getting providers is the School for the Visually Impaired and Blind in Janesville, the School for the Deaf in Delavan. They put bids out for speech language, music therapy, other services, OTPT, every few years. And so then whoever is there, right, if you're working with a CESA, it doesn't mean CESA is going to have the bid which will be accepted. So it does create a tough situation, again, for, as Mason describes it, WSD. Sarah wrote, as I reflect on the School Threat Assessment Coalition of Kenosha, STAC, one thing that stands out is how intentionally multidisciplinary the effort is, not just a school system initiative, but a community-wide partnership that brings together the district attorney's office, law enforcement, social services, juvenile court intake, and multiple school districts around a shared threat assessment framework. Yes, Sarah, I am equally impressed. STAC is amazing for the reasons that you noted. I was fortunate to know a few of the school leaders who were involved in its development. And I was teaching a class and they were presenting and I was like, well, I've never heard about this. And that is a problem, right? Because how is that information being disseminated out to the rest of the state? So if I was a pupil services director and I was aware of STAC, I would be calling over to one of the directors in that area and say, tell me more about this. How did it come to be? What is your role as a district? And then also how, working with a couple districts around you, maybe a couple providers, how might we replicate that here? Might we want to replicate that here? But it is amazing. And again, I would encourage advocacy that, we have a statewide conference, whether it's run by the DPI or some of the CESAs, whatever, but it is just surely the innovation sharing conference. That's all it is. And that would be a lot. It would be amazing. And imagine, either WCAS or the DPI or whatever, having a presentation where representatives from STAC come in and present, right? So again, you're, linking, trying to decrease truancy, trying to increase access to timely mental health and so on. But Arlie wrote, we also contract interpreter services when needed, while we have Spanish speaking and Somali speaking engagement counselors who regularly support families. External interpreter services are sometimes necessary. In a virtual setting, this can be challenging, particularly during IEP meetings, as interpreters may not always be familiar with special education processes in addition to navigating language translation. That's an excellent point, right? Because since 2020, we've made a pivot to a lot of virtual meetings, even just, regular IEP meetings being held virtually. So now we bring an interpreter into that mix. How does that work? So again, Arlie, you mentioned that IEP meetings can be cumbersome for interpreters when they are not familiar with the IEP process or terminology. And that's an important point. I'm glad you made that. I collaborated with a district in California that used an agenda-based IEP format with brief descriptions of each section. The agenda was required for every meeting and was printed in English with Spanish, Somali, or another language beneath it. So you can imagine an agenda of the IEP, like introductions and present level and, goals, frequency, sort of whatever. And there would be, those items would all be numbered, and there would be a short statement, a sentence or two in English, and underneath it'd be in Spanish or Somali. It wasn't in all of those languages. You would only bring up the forms that were applicable for the meeting. but it helped people stay on track, right? To kind of know where they were during the meeting. It helped the interpreter by having a few reference points of, okay, this is as I share this over to the parent, like, this is what I'm going to say. That worked really well for that district. I also remember my first IEP meetings with translators, and after the meeting, getting some follow-up from the translator saying, hey, make sure you pause more during the meeting, because right, I remember talking to a teacher who did an awesome job with IEP meetings, but one of the things she kept saying is, I can do an IEP meeting in 15 minutes. And sometimes, like, that does work out and everything, can be covered. But if you're having an interpreter involved, we're not looking for the fastest IEP meeting. We're looking for opportunities to pause and to allow the parent to ask questions, or for school staff to ask, kind of to see if the information was clearly conveyed, or give the opportunity for the translator to, have that interaction with the parent, and just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Renee wrote, areas of need that CESA can help support our district include FBAs, BIP resources, which we are currently taking advantage of, data dig specific to our indicator and statewide assessment data, and EMLSS, which is Wisconsin's Equitable Multi-Level Systems of Support, which centers on student access to academic, behavioral, social, emotional, and mental health supports. So yes, Renee, very sharp observation, especially the potential to contract with CESA for FBAs and BIP support, simply for the fact that bringing in a professional who knows schools and is fresh to the environment, right? They might observe things or pull information from data that you overlook. I remember having someone come in to help us with a behavior intervention plan, and FBA, just as you've indicated, and they noticed that in the room where the student was sitting, to the right of the student, there were several shelves going up with, all kinds of stuff. And that as she was observing the student periodically would kind of look over at these things like, I'm not sure how sturdy these are. And I don't like, you could, she was saying, I think like the student actually doesn't want to be sitting next to these things. And that was something everybody just kind of overlooked, because I had been in the class for years. So it was part of the plan. It was to give the student a seat that was also kind of not next to this shelving complex. So I brought in a contract behavioral specialist, actually two from Imagine a Child's Capacity, a few times to assist with comprehensive behavior assessments. What we would actually do is, we would book the conference room for a morning or an afternoon, bring in the banker's box of student records, and we would go through every piece of paper, just what was there, and try to put things in order and pull out and then really inform our plan going forward. And that was extremely helpful. I mean, we didn't do it a lot, but we always had a handful of students with extremely complex profiles, or that, they had moved to us. And then you get all of these records, but to go in and to spend that time. So I think it's very well worth it in those instances. Week 4, mental health, trauma-sensitive schools, seeking student input in Moodle. Suicide prevention resources address this at the beginning of the year, always. And again at mid-year, because you have new staff come in, you have new students come in, there's just entropy, like people aren't as familiar with it once you come back from Christmas break. CESAs offer this training. Other agencies do too. Also consider how staff will educate students about the signs of suicide and your district's suicide investigation protocol, which should include documentation, right? Not just a student is meeting with a counselor and saying, hey, I'm concerned about my friend. And then, because I've seen some cuts or some posts online or whatever. And, the counselor meets with that person. As a pupil services director, you need to understand the process that your counselor's using, what kind of interview techniques they're doing with the student, what questions they're asking, what they're documenting, not just, oh, I met with the student on this date because of concerns shared that they might be harming themselves. So we need some process of that they are collecting data on that. DPI's trauma sensitive schools, their online professional development is robust and free. The CDC School Connectedness and YRBS, talk about those. Wisconsin Indian Education Association and UW's multi-educational or multicultural student center, which has outreach. Reflective teaching annotation. Understand the capabilities and limitations of your assessment tools. The YRBS is not a mental health assessment. School staff typically are not trained or licensed to diagnose mental health conditions in children. We are in a time of disruption with OHI and 504 and long COVID, and the roles of teachers will catch up to that change. But kind of coming back, the YRBS is really a screener, and it brings in a lot of data and will give you kind of a feel for what's going on. It is not an assessment. And the YRBS can also be challenging for students with disabilities or English language learners. Here's an example of a question that says, that ask, in the past year, have you, felt unsafe at school? Okay. Something like that. They're very similar sets of questions in the YRBS. So one is like, what's a year? Is it a school year? Is it a calendar year? And unsafe. Yeah, but what should go along with that is where? Like, is it at the entrance? Is it in a certain hallway area? Like, what part of the school are students reporting that they feel unsafe or that bullying is more likely to happen? So then that's helpful because you can direct supervision to that area, maybe also, cameras into that area. But again, I've seen people use the YRBS in ways that either was never intended to do or just this huge extrapolation and kind of leap of faith based upon that information. Again, it is not an assessment. Student-to-student relationships have become more and more complicated in our time of social media. Counselors, SROs, or your local district attorney should inform students of consequences of harmful relationships and posting compromising images online. Get out ahead of this as a pupil services director, meaning, bringing in your SRO or district attorney or both of them, right, and your counselors and present at grade level or even class, to class and indicate, hey, if you do this, here are the implications of that personally, and then also, for your family and for your community. And sometimes, kids do stuff without really thinking it through, and then how this information gets shared. And also, staff are going to have questions, or a student is going to have a question. Somebody shared this image to me. Well, now it's on my phone. Like, do I take it to the adult? Do I email it to an adult? Well, no, you don't want to email it to an adult. I mean, what do you do with that? So those areas, I think, are very under-addressed in schools. And again, we are seeing a time where AI is being used to modify images. Just most recently, the Jefferson School District in Wisconsin, news article in the last couple of weeks coming out where a student was having pictures of classmates and modifying with AI to have apparently like sexualized content. A year ago, a student in this class who was a pupil services director shared that in her district, there was a neighboring team that came over for a basketball game, and one of the fans, a student, took pictures of the vinyl images of the female athletes that were up along the wall. This is very common in schools, right? We see these, kind of like 3x5 vinyl, hey, recognizing the seniors. But then the student who took these images modified them to place these females in compromising, situations, right? So, and then shared that online. So it was an investigation between both districts, and then the police were involved in counseling for the students who were impacted by that. And again, this is only going to get worse, unfortunately. And we don't see this being addressed sufficiently at state conferences. and this is where it has to probably come organic, or working with your neighboring districts, or, in your county, and saying, let's try to get out ahead of this and get some involvement with the student body on this. The syllabus. Read chapter 1 of School of Airs, how thinking about a bagel can get you through the worst day of your life. What does this mean for authentic experiences for students? Will the metaverse increase experiences or shrink them even more? What are the pros and cons of virtual reality field trips? Yes, this is becoming a thing. Go to Washington, D.C., but really you're just going to the gymnasium and putting on a VR headset and someone is walking around, right? And you're feeling something, and it's like, oh, this is the Washington Monument. Well, no, it's actually a volleyball pole. But on the flip side of that, there are some pretty interesting and fascinating opportunities for VR. Like, we're going to go into the Amazon, right? And you can have some sounds and maybe some things that go along with that. So, but I don't think it should automatically default as a replacement. Wrote about that in School of Airs, the tendency to back away from in-person experiences because virtual is safer, but it's also obviously not authentic. Read my article about Abeyance Agreements that was featured in the November 2022 issue of Phi Delta Kappan. Be informed that Abeyance Agreements do not originate from education law and can be discriminatory in practice if they're used to deny access to students. I'm opposed to Abeyance Agreements, but I also understand they're widely used in schools. You might know them as second chance agreements or a pre-expulsion agreement. And some of them are just a page. Hey, listen, whatever you did, your violation of code of student conduct, here, follow the rules for the next 30 days. And as long as you do that, this instant is wiped off your record. Now, the problem is when we have abeyance agreements, we're destroying potential student records. So Rachel Cox did an amazing legal note on this, which I also share in class. And I had worked with Rachel on kind of tackling abeyance agreements a few years ago. She is an attorney. But suddenly something happens with a student when they're in 7th grade and you're going back through their files and their entries into whatever database, Skyward, Infinite Campus, whatever you have. And you're like, wow, I don't really see anything. And the IP team wasn't reconvened to talk about, certain behaviors or safety plan, or I guess FBA, BIP. And then, people kind of just anecdotally say, oh yeah, like that, this event happened 2 years ago. And then 3 years ago, there was another event and then other things, but that just got handled kind of at a district site-based management level. There's not an entry in Skyward. So we don't really have these student records to pull from to give us a more informed mosaic of what is happening with the student. So again, I understand the argument, and I do very clearly in my article identify a way that abeyance agreements could exist, but they would need to be reportable. Part of this was under the Obama administration to push for schools to have fewer students expelled and fewer students suspended, and that's when abeyance agreements, in my observation of years of doing this, really took off. The abeyance agreement is basically a magic wand. Again, follow the rules for 30 days and it disappears. All right, everybody. I've really enjoyed the post during week 3. We've had a certain uptick in energy in the class. I love it. So keep going into week 4. Again, over the next few days, I'll be grading your SWOTs and I will return them to you. I'll send out an email when they are all graded. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy this nice warm weather.